The Final Station is a 2D action survival game released in 2016 by developer Do My Best, and follows the story of a train driver named Edward Jones as he makes his way across the country while trying to survive the end of the world. While he does so, he overhears conversations between the various passengers on his train and finds notes scattered throughout the land that reveal the background of the world and the mysterious circumstances surrounding the apocalypse he faces. The game was followed up by a DLC named The Only Traitor that fleshed out more of the background of the world and its various characters in order to fill in some of the gaps of the story. However, due to a slew of issues, like the scattering of the notes, the need to juggle the health of the survivors and the health of the train in the base game, and some translation/grammatical errors in the writing, it can be easy to miss some vital pieces of information and thus make it difficult to fully understand everything that's happening in the story. So, with no restraint on spoilers, let's take the time to gather up all the information and present it here so that we can see the full story of The Final Station. The story starts 106 years before the events of the game in an unnamed country. While some of the populace did live simple lives in rural areas, like in the plains of the north or the mountains to the west, at this point in its history, the society of the country had developed to the point of using locomotives to transport supplies and goods throughout their land. A vast railway that was centered on the city of Keskis, which was the main train station of the country. By all accounts, it was a time of peace, but that changed when suddenly, strange metallic capsules began raining from the sky in the western part of the land. From these capsules, a gas emanated that was seemingly innocuous, but a short time after people breathed in the gas, they began to become ill, spiking a fever and throwing up strange black bile that stuck itself to their bodies. Although medical professionals tried their best, nothing they did alleviated these symptoms, and they could only watch as their patients got worse and worse, until eventually the black bile consumed their bodies. At this point, the patient then experienced a violent change in behavior. They became highly aggressive and attacked any non-infected person close by. And to make matters worse, they were inconsolable once in this state, meaning the only way to pacify them was to kill them. But even this was difficult to do as the patients shrugged off damage that would stop most people in their tracks. While the country struggled to deal with these transformations of their friends and family, a coinciding event occurred that clarified where these capsules came from. From a canyon by the mountains, there suddenly appeared gigantic, otherworldly beings. Realizing that these entities were the source of the capsules, the people of the country began to retaliate against the entities, attempting to defeat them to end their attack on their world. But humanity's opposition was quickly put down by the creatures who were not only far larger than them, but also more technologically advanced. As their armies and their cities were destroyed under the boots of the creatures, humanity began to resign itself to its doom. However, just as suddenly as they appeared, the otherworldly beings vanished, leaving mankind to live another day. Although they had survived their encounter with these beings, an event that came to be known as the Visitation, the country had been pushed to the brink of disaster. The area where these visitors had appeared was completely devastated, and thousands of people from that region were now homeless and fleeing to other parts of the country. These refugees, called settlers, were treated with hostility by the local populations of the regions they fled to, as the people there didn't believe their story of a visitation and hated the strain that the settlers put on their resources. Despite their hostility, though, the truth was soon undeniable. Humanity had been attacked by a more advanced civilization and only lived because the attackers pulled back. The most terrifying thought about the visitation was that this wouldn't be a one-time incident, that there would be a second visitation, one where humanity would truly be wiped out by the visitors. It was a time of uncertainty, doubt, and fear. And it was at this point that a man appeared and vowed that the next time the visitors came, humanity would be ready. That man was named Vermond White, and from the ashes of the old world, he rose to become the leader of the fractured country and brought it together so it could begin to repair the damage of the first visitation. As his healing started, however, Vermond realized he wouldn't be able to manage everything on his own, so he created a council that would help him lead. On its surface, the council was said to be made up of the greatest minds of the country, but in reality, it was made up of only 4 men: Vermond White, Arthur Vane, Christoph Thornton, and Theodore Belfour. While Vermond was idealistic, he knew that what he really needed to rebuild the country and prepare it for a second visitation was money, a resource that each of these 3 men had in spades. However, they were also men that the populace of the country did not want to see in power, as they had connections to criminal organizations and were mired in corruption scandals. So Vermond, needing to keep the populace on his side, deceived them and kept the true identities of the members of the council a secret, so that his dream of rebuilding his country would come to fruition. With the monetary backing of the council, the country experienced an influx of societal development. A new capital city named Metropole was built, and the council took up residence in the city. Construction of a huge wall around Metropole was started so the city could be defended from the visitors. Soldiers were trained and armed as a military was built to fight the visitors, and the citizens of the country began undergoing drills on what to do in the event of the next visitation. It was during this period of rebuilding that a revolutionary discovery was made that changed the course of society. In a location near Emmerich's crater in the north, miners had discovered a green crystal during an excavation. Once this crystal, which came to be known as electrum, was mined, it could be used as an energy source that was cheaper and more efficient than oil. The council immediately saw the potential in harnessing this wonder material and organized follow-up operations to find more electrum fields around Emmerich's crater, but no field was ever found. That is, until years later when rich electrum fields were found in a location south of Emmerich's crater. The area was immediately claimed by the council, which built a huge factory named Nibelherz to collect and process the electrum. Naturally, as workers were sent to the factory, a city sprouted up around the facility, and this city, named Ristel, together with a factory, stood as proof of electrum's efficacy, as the whole of the factory and the city was powered by a large crystal of electrum at the factory's core. Led by the energy industry leader of the council, Christoph Thornton, Ristel and Nibelherz pushed the country to new heights with the power of electrum. While Vermond knew they were headed in the right direction, he also knew that the weapons humanity currently had would do little, if any, damage to the visitors. That, just like in the first visitation, the visitors would likely shake off their attack and decimate them. In order to change the tide of the battle, humanity would have to develop weapons and technology that was currently unprecedented. And then Vermond thought of the region where the visitors first appeared. Ever since the first visitation, a taboo hung over the area of the country that was devastated by the visitors, and it had become a no man's land. But left in the wastes of the old world was a bunch of technology that the visitors left behind. Vermond knew that if that technology could be gathered, then it could be the catalyst to developing the type of weapons and technology needed to not only live through a second visitation, but fight off the otherworldly attackers and end their threat forever. So he created a unit and sent it into the first visitation zone. There were high casualty rates among the thousands of troops that were sent, but they managed to succeed in their mission and return with the technology of the visitors. Out in the mountains in the west, close to the visitation zone, a special laboratory named El Ab's Research Complex was built to study these artifacts. It was at this point that 2 brothers, Arkady and Boris Strugatsky, began documenting and recording their findings of the visitors' technology into a knowledge base. However, it was soon found that no one could use this information. That is, until a man named Dennis Morgan appeared. Orphaned at a young age, Dennis Morgan had been a fugitive for most of his life, But amazingly, he was able to make sense of the visitors' technology and use it to create many wondrous new inventions for humanity, such as the van posts of the town Wallach, whose staffing needs led to a population boom for the city. Due to his brilliance, Dennis became known as the blacksmith, and his genius became the foundation from which a multitude of life-changing projects were launched. A particularly ambitious project of the blacksmith centered on the trains that were integral to the country's upkeep. In a special facility near the El Abs Research Complex, he designed a special line of trains called the Bellis Line to be used in the event of the second visitation. These special trains were designed to prevent the gas of the capsules from entering the cabins, maximize the survivability of the occupants in the event of an encounter with the visitors, and outspeed the giant beings if it came to a chase. But most integral of all was a special reactor that was installed inside the chassis of the train. Retrieved from the zone at the first visitation, these reactors emitted a special kind of radiation that prevented the transformation prompted by the gas that was so dangerous to humanity, meaning those that resided inside would be protected from the visitor's primary attack vector. The work was promising, but just as the engineers were on the cusp of finalizing the design and moving to mass-produce the locomotives, the blacksmith was called away by Vermond White to work on another project. Although the engineers left behind tried to do what they could to progress the work on the Bellis Line, the blacksmith hadn't left any records of what the next steps of the work should be, and without his genius, they struggled to make significant progress. While their work wallowed in limbo, they hoped that the project the blacksmith was working on now was as promising as Vermond believed it to be. And Vermond truly believed he had dreamed up the solution to the visitor problem. While the reactors in the Bellis Line could ensure that people weren't transformed into the soldiers of the visitors, it wasn't actually addressing the biggest problem of dealing with the invaders, as the monsters, although terrifying, could be put down by conventional weapons. The biggest threat of the invaders were the visitors themselves, as with their sheer size alone, they could overwhelm any defending force, not to mention the effect their advanced technology had on the fighting. Humanity needed a way to fight back against the visitors themselves, something that could match and even overwhelm them in strength. And that's when he came up with the concept of the Guardian. The Guardian would be a gigantic robot that would be worked on by the brightest minds in the country using the best technology available until it was perfected in design and equipped with the firepower needed to be the savior of humanity. The task ahead of it was a challenging one, but Vermond promised no expense would be spared on the project, and he kept true to his word. A call was put out to the general population to come and work on the robot, which created a large, persistent workforce that was always maintaining and improving the Guardian. A large swath of Metropole was designated as uninhabitable and unusable for businesses, as the shockwave of the Guardian launch would completely destroy anything within a certain radius. The best researchers and scientists worked on the central processing core that would serve as its brain, and even the large electrum crystal core that powered the factory and city of Ristal was designated as the power source for the Guardian. The Guardian soon became the symbol of hope for the nation, and stories of awe and wonder filled the hearts and minds of its populace. A populace that likewise had to be prepared for the fighting, which led to Vermond ordering the construction of bunkers across the land where civilians could hunker down and be safe while the fighting took place above. While the construction of the Guardian was an executive order that was met with resounding approval among the populace, it wasn't popular with everyone, in particular with the other members of Vermond's council. In fact, many of his orders had upset them as they were expensive, not turning a profit for them. While they dealt with it throughout the years, the drain the Guardian put on their finances was the last straw, and, behind closed doors, the council overthrew Vermond and replaced him with his son Armand. To the populace, it appeared that their leader had just vanished, but in reality, he was sent to a secret prison where he was tortured and eventually killed by the council. Vermond had seen this coming for years, but knew he couldn't stop it without putting all that he and so many others had worked for at risk. So, he accepted his fate. Before the end, he wrote a letter to Adam Thornton, the son of Christoph Thornton, one of the members of the council, begging him to work with the blacksmith to continue his work and to save humanity. But most important of all, he warned Adam about Arthur Vane, who, out of the other members of the council, Vermond knew was the biggest danger to their goals, and that danger came from a secret of the first visitation. While it was a well-known fact that people turned into goo-covered monsters when exposed to the gas of the capsules, there was another effect that was missed by most people. The gas didn't affect everyone the same way. While some people became more passive monsters, others were vicious attackers, and some even turned into bombs, exploding into a dark poisonous cloud when killed. Wanting to understand what caused these variances, experiments with the gas were conducted on the country's prisoners, and it was found that the transformation a person underwent depended on their personality traits. The more violent and impulsive their personality, the more violent a monster they became. However, there were also cases where people didn't undergo any transformation at all, a phenomenon that was seen in a handful of survivors from the first visitation. The only indication that these people had been exposed to the gas was a change in color in one of their eyes to white. Well, that and an extended lifespan, as it was eventually noticed that every survivor of the first visitation lived to be over 100 years old. But more puzzling was the change that manifested in an even smaller amount of people that were intelligent, driven, and ambitious. These people, who had both of their eyes turned white, didn't become a monster either, and follow-up tests showed that these people actually had their physical and mental attributes enhanced. To understand these variances, more research was conducted into the properties of the gas, and it was eventually found that it was actually designed to encourage positive cell growth, to make a subject smarter, faster, and longer lived. Essentially, to make them superhuman, meaning these latter outcomes were the intended effect of the gas. It was almost like it wasn't meant to be a weapon or a virus, it was meant to be a medicine. That was the conclusion reached by Arthur Vane, who, in some unknown way, underwent the superhuman transformation himself, becoming reborn. And once he did so, he had an epiphany about the true nature of the visitation. The coming of the visitors wasn't a curse, it was a blessing. The visitors had come to the planet not to destroy humanity, but to help it evolve, to enhance its best and brightest minds so that they could usher in a new golden age in its history, using the gas as the catalyst to kickstart this evolution. Although it was unfortunate that there would be casualties along the way due to most of humanity not being able to handle the medicine, Arthur knew it was a necessary sacrifice to make in order to serve the greater good of the whole of mankind. He thus decided that he would help the visitors in their benevolent gesture to mankind, and work with them to usher in this next step in humanity's evolution. This had put him at odds with Vermond, who did not want to see all the death that would accompany a return of the visitors. But with Vermond's imprisonment and death, Arthur was free to do what he needed to in order to prepare the country and mankind for their evolution. Seeing as how Vermond had spent decades building up a society that would resist a return of the visitors, Arthur decided to work behind the scenes to gradually wear down that resistance and make the society more willing to accept the change they would undergo. He decided to go about this in a top-down manner, convincing the other members of the council to come over to his side so they would institute the changes necessary to meet his goals, beginning with its president. Although it took some convincing, he managed to persuade Armand White to agree with his argument that the change of the world was inevitable, and it was better to cooperate with Arthur and his overseers to ensure humanity's survival. Thus, over several years, the president of the country made a variety of sweeping changes to the nation to best align it with his and Arthur's needs. Various social programs started by his father were ended. the military was greatly reduced and de-armed, to the point that the only unit remaining was one that stubbornly refused to follow any order that was not from Vermont himself. He passed a decree that made owning a firearm punishable with life imprisonment, which filled the country's prison and was useful in weeding out the more impulsive and violent members of society. He took control of the publishing firms of the nation and forbid any media that painted the government in a bad light or worked to expose the workings of the council. He banned further research into artifacts from the first visitation zone, shutting down the work of the Bellis line of trains as a result, although not before one was sent north to be tested. A story of a tragic disaster at a station named Exeter 5 was fabricated and used to justify the installation of blockers at each train station, hampering the railway of the country. And he stopped the work on the wall around Metropole and even the Guardian itself. The changes had the desired effect on the country, and many people began to grow complacent in their preparation for the second visitation. Some even started to doubt that the first visitation happened at all, and others even started to question the efficacy and necessity of the Guardian, to the point of saying it was a detriment to the country to continue working on it. While he had managed to convince Armand, Arthur had less success in convincing the other members of the council. The blacksmith outright refused to work with him, even after Arthur promised him that he could ensure he would be reborn and not become a monster when the time came. And although Adam Thornton seemed to go along with his plans, Adam secretly refused to work with Arthur as well, motivated by the letters he received from Vermont in his youth. In fact, both men worked on plans of their own to continue Vermont's legacy. They recognized that although the Guardian was likely to be destroyed by the visitors, it was their best chance of survival. So while the blacksmith worked on perfecting its design, despite the obstacles Armand's government was now putting in his way, Adam had a variety of experiments conducted with Electrum to try and enhance the power of Ristol's crystal core, hoping that if it could be pushed further, it would give the Guardian the edge it needed to overcome the visitors, while also feigning that he would cripple the core when the time came for it to be used for the Guardian. Meanwhile, Armand and Arthur were vetting candidates from across the country to find out which ones would be the most suitable for undergoing the procedure to become reborn, and housing these people into the bunkers built by Vermont, which would now be used to house the reborn instead of the general populace like originally envisioned. A process that Adam Thornton tried to interfere with and undermine by reassigning people to other bunkers and closing one shelter, the Sandstein shelter, early. While the citizens of the country had grown complacent over the years, they weren't blind, and some people observed these duplicitous moves with suspicion. The remnants of Vermont's military units started preparing a contingency plan to deal with the Guardian if it didn't behave the way they expected. And a number of citizens across the country became doomsday preppers who still readied themselves for the second visitation. Some of these preppers even made incredible discoveries, like one man who discovered that the visitors could suddenly appear out of thin air by crossing strings and effectively opening a portal in space. The man even used the same logic to conclude that the visitors would appear in the same place as before if they came back to the country. Others even reached the same conclusion that Arthur did and saw the visitors as saviors for humanity, forming religious cults around the coming of the visitors, such as the Order of the Advent, which was led by a man named Remus Woods, who, judging by his one white eye, seemed to have an encounter with the gas of his own. The Order of the Advent also seemed to perceive the moves of the government with incredible accuracy, as they had been able to determine the government's new policy with regards to the bunkers and decided to build their own bunker in the western part of the region as a result, something that they used to gather more and more people to their cause. However, the doomsday preppers and religious fanatics were the exception and not the rule when it came to the general populace of the country, and for 106 years after the first visitation, most people lived ordinary, simple lives, until the day came where everything changed forever. In the rural town of Redmond, in the northern reaches of the country, there lived a man named Edward Jones. Edward worked as a train driver, using the country's expansive railway to transport goods and materials between the various towns and cities of the land. While he liked his work, it was hard for him, as at times it kept him away from his young daughter, a girl that loved and admired her father. But despite this difficulty, he did his duty faithfully. One day, after waking from a nightmare where he saw a crowd of reborn and was killed by some of the transformed monsters, Edward headed off to work, where he learned that he would be delivering an experimental train, the Bellis 7, the only train manufactured by the engineers in the rail factory to make it out for testing, to Willstream, a journey that would take a day to complete. As he and his supervisor started making their way south, though, they began to notice some strange events. Regularly scheduled trains were late or had their routes changed. Communication lines to the western part of the country were interrupted or broken. The main station at Keskis was refusing to sell tickets for any trains, and there was even a rumor that the council had been evacuated. Any misgivings that something was wrong were put to rest when Edward and his passengers saw explosions, then heard gunshots as they pulled away from Keskis. Not long after, the Bellis 7 was stopped at an emergency station set up by the military, and Edward was told to go meet with the commanding officer. Edward passed through a clinic on his way there, where he saw a sight that confirmed his fears. Strewn all over the building were people covered with black bile, evidence that the second visitation had started. The general didn't hide the fact when Edward met with him moments later, telling him that the visitors appeared in the west, just like the Doomsday Prepper predicted, and were now carving a path of destruction through the northern part of the country. Their appearance necessitated a change in Edward's mission. A special cargo was being attached to his train, which he was meant to deliver to the city of New Costfield in the south. Edward tried to protest, to say that he needed to get back home to his daughter, but the general told him that he had a duty now, and a responsibility to see it through. Reluctantly, Edward accepted his charge, and with 2 soldiers joining him as escort, he set out to complete his new delivery. Just in time, too, as just as he was pulling away, the visitors appeared above the emergency station and engaged in an explosive fight with Vermont's tank division. A fight that the military lost. Thanks to the Bellis 7, Edward was able to outrun the visitors before suffering the same fate as the tanks. But strangely, his soldier escorts weren't as lucky. The only thing that remained of them after the frightening encounter with the visitors were bloodstains on the wall of the cabin. When he was assigned his new mission, Edward had also received permission to use firearms. It was an order he was thankful for, as although the general had said the region hadn't been hit by the visitors yet, dozens of monsters filled the towns on the way to New Costfield. Monsters he was able to fight off thanks to the weapon he could now wield. Edward also passed a few of the capsules of the visitors on his way south, too, hearing their industrial groan as they expelled the gas to their surroundings. However, he was kept safe from the effects of the gas thanks to the reactor of the Bellis 7 that he rode in. With the protections afforded to him, Edward was able to successfully drop the military's cargo off in New Costfield. As he pulled off to head to Bristol, his next stop, a flash of blinding light, a wave of intense heat, a deafening explosion, and a towering mushroom cloud revealed to him just what he had been carrying, and how far the military was willing to go in order to turn the tide of the battle in their favor. Edward then pulled into Bristol, the city of Electrum production that was controlled by Adam Thornton, to find everyone here blissfully unaware of the chaos going on outside their city. With his task now done, Edward hoped that he would be able to head home to see his daughter, and even tried calling, but couldn't get through. The communication lines were still down. But before he was given a blocker code and allowed to leave, he was told that Adam Thornton wanted to meet with him. Edward headed up to the peak of Nibelhurst and met with Adam, who explained that in the event of the second visitation, he was to deliver Ristel's crystal core to Metropole to power the Guardian with it. When this situation arose, the council was to organize the transportation required to get the core to the city. But contradictingly, they had shut down all the railway traffic across the country, as Edward had seen in Keskis. This was, of course, manufactured by design by Arthur and Armand to prepare humanity for the takeover of the Reborn. But somehow, the Bellis 7 had been missed or unaccounted for in their plan, giving Adam a method of transporting the crystal. Although Adam didn't have much faith in Edward and his ability, he was the only chance he had, so he ordered Ristel's crystal to be attached to Edward's train and ordered him to take it to the capital city. Edward had no choice but to accept, and knew that, along the way, he had to stop by the LAB's bunker to pick up the central processor from the facility to bring it to Metropole as well, so pulled out of Ristel and started a course to the mountains in the west. Shortly after he left Ristel, another man named Peter Glean arrived in the city. Unlike most other people, Peter was a doomsday prepper, and ever since the second visitation began, he had been traveling across the country trying to get into one of its shelters. He had first tried to get into the Sandstein shelter, only to learn that it was closed by the Reborn a month ago, so had driven to Ristel to try and get into its shelter, passing through Keskis on the way to find it in ruins following its encounter with the visitors. It was the same sight he was greeted with when he pulled into Ristel, as, evidently, shortly after Edward left, the visitors had descended upon the city and destroyed it, likely due to Adam's continued resistance in coming to their side. While exploring the ruins of the city, Peter actually came across Adam and Arthur having a conversation, where he learned that, among other things, the Ristel shelter had been closed by Adam, a final statement of defiance by Adam to Arthur and his goals. Although disappointed, Arthur pulled Adam into the other room to have a conversation with Armand. Peter gave chase, but Arthur shut the door in his face, and when Peter opened it, a completely different room stood in front of Peter, indicating that in Arthur's time as a vassal for the visitors, he had learned how to use their teleportation ability himself. With no other option ahead of him, Peter left Ristel to head to the only shelter that was still open, the LAB's shelter in the mountains to the west. Along the way, Peter crashed his car and was forced to continue on foot, whereupon he accidentally stumbled into the shelter constructed by the Order of the Advent, disguised as one of their members. Throughout his journey, Peter had come across a couple of the cult members and was surprised to find that they tried to attack him. Stranger still was the cell that he saw once in the back of a truck they were driving. At the time, he wondered what the cultists could be doing, and the answer to that question became clear when he found dozens of people locked within cages in the shelter of the Order. As he moved deeper within, he was horrified to find that these kidnapped people were being subjected to experiments with the gas of the visitors. The Order had been trying to make a reborn of their own, and a note found by Peter indicated that, out of the hundreds of people tested, none had produced the intended effect thus far. Eventually, one of the cult members saw through Peter's disguise and ordered his demise. Peter ran for his life, and then someone unexpected came to his aid. At the end of a hall, Arthur held open a door, telling Peter to go in. Peter dove through and was relieved to find that the cultists were no longer chasing him, evidently a result of Arthur using the teleportation ability he knew. His relief gave way to confusion as he found that the building he was in was partially blown away, revealing a field of black that was broken only by the yellow light of the sun lying below the horizon. He then came across several conversations, yet the people speaking never took notice of him as they spoke. There was a conversation between Adam and Armand, apparently held after the destruction of Ristel, where Armand begged Adam to cooperate. A conversation with the blacksmith and Arthur, where Arthur failed to convince him to join his cause. And a conversation held between Arthur and Armand, where he said he managed to get Adam to their side, and where Armand thanked Arthur for all he'd done. Peter continued on through the halls until he was greeted by Arthur in a dead-end room. Knowing Peter was trying to get to the L-Lab's bunker, Arthur told him he would get him there if Peter would do something for him. Peter had to kill someone. Peter was hesitant to agree, asking Arthur why he couldn't do it, to which Arthur answered that his overseers wouldn't allow him to, indicating the visitors had instructed him to hold back for some reason. Arthur then trapped Peter in the room, threatening to leave him here if he didn't agree, which finally made Peter give in. He asked Arthur who he was supposed to kill, to which Arthur answered, "The man that walks through that door." He suddenly vanished, and then the door opened, and Edward Jones walked into the room. After leaving Bristol, Edward passed through a couple of towns before entering a tunnel, something that confused him as there shouldn't have been a tunnel on the route to the L-Lab's bunker. It was while exploring the first station in this tunnel that he came upon the panicked Peter, whom he told he was taking a train to the L-Lab's shelter and asked if he wanted to go. Peter agreed and hopped aboard Edward's train. Peter wasn't the only person Edward had met while exploring the station, as he came across a reborn during his explorations too, and he had come across a number of strange rooms in the station. Furthermore, a soldier that Edward had picked up as a passenger said that this tunnel was not a military installation, as it was too close to the site of the first visitation. All of this implied that this was a secret bunker used by Arthur and Armand, where they conducted their work to undermine the country. But this didn't explain how the train had gotten there, as there was only one railway through this region, and it didn't pass through the tunnel. Edward got some answers from the second station. While exploring it, he found a small cabin, and when he entered the building, he came upon Armand White and Adam Thornton speaking with two reborn. Close to the door slept Arthur Vane. The group, outside of Adam, was surprised to see Edward before them, with one of the reborn speculating that the Bellis 7 could be responsible for how Edward ended up before them, hinting that thanks to being outfitted with technology from the visitors, the Bellis 7 passed through one of the portals used by the visitors and Arthur to come to this secret bunker. Armand, realizing Edward was the one carrying the crystal that would power the Guardian, suggested they overpower Edward and take the crystal from him, but was talked out of it by one of the reborn who commented that they could not interfere just yet, so Armand had to do with kicking Edward out into the darkness of the tunnel. As Edward made it back to the Bellis 7, he found a blocker code with a note that there was still time, likely left by Adam, who, evidently, was still resisting the plans of the reborn. As Edward began to leave the tunnel, the train passed through a large warehouse packed full of capsules from the visitors, further cementing the area as a bunker of the reborn and the visitors. And the energy of the place had an ill effect on the passengers Edward had with him. They all started begging him to stop the train and let them off so that they could stay here. But then they began telling him to stay on his route and ignore what he was seeing. It seemed like the voice that came from them wasn't their own. Edward heeded this latter advice and stayed on course, eventually exiting the warehouse and subsequently the tunnel, whereupon the strange behavior of his passengers stopped. Not long after, the train pulled up to the L-Lab's bunker and all the passengers disembarked, including Peter Glean, who apparently decided not to follow through on his deal with Arthur now that he had safely reached a shelter. Edward didn't stay at the bunker long, as he soon met with the head scientist of the facility, who installed the central processor onto the Bellis 7 and was sent on his way again. On the way to Metropole, Edward passed through a couple of interesting stations. There was a personal station that was built into the side of a mountain at the behest of an anonymous benefactor, which appeared to be former council member Theodore Belfour, who was using the building to abduct people and force them to undergo the monstrous transformation of the gas, and then use the bile from their transformation to make some sort of potion or cocktail that would make him reborn, an effort that had failed him thus far. Edward also passed through an abandoned military base where he found a pair of reborn that had come to the base to look for weapons despite Armand's protestations, and where Edward could launch a rocket that had been presumably prepared for the visitors. After pulling away from the military base, Edward and any survivors he'd gathered pulled into Metropole, straight into the workshop of the blacksmith, where they all beheld the massive, unfathomable expanse of the Guardian with their own eyes. With a successful delivery of the crystal and the central processor, the Guardian was now set to be started up, whereupon it could begin the fight against the visitors and save humanity from the wrath. Edward, however, did not want to stay in the safety of Metropole. He wanted to return home to Redmond so he could check on his daughter, and maybe even bring her back so they could both be safe. He made requests to his fellow train engineers to be allowed to take the Bella 7 north, and although they were reluctant to let him go, partly because they would be putting their own jobs at risk by doing so, they agreed to open the gates and let Edward go. As he pulled out of Metropole, Edward watched the symbol of hope for mankind launch from its station in the city and fly off to begin its fight for humanity. But he soon turned his eyes away from the robot and readied himself for the journey home. At a station not far outside Metropole, Edward disembarked and scavenged through a nearby building to find a wall covered head to toe in information about him and the Bellis 7. A note lying close by hinted that he was the target of a squad specifically designed to take him out and take over his train. He cautiously moved further within the structures until eventually coming upon Arthur, surrounded by several dead bodies of the monsters. Arthur simply said that he would join Edward on his train, and the two then departed to continue the journey northwards. Despite obviously having to deal with Edward, Arthur evidently still couldn't take direct action against him, mentioning that he had to wait until he turned to do anything. He then broke the news that the Bellis 7 would soon stop, that its radiation had protected him long enough, that it was time for Edward to take his medicine, just like everybody else inevitably would, and that he would be there to deal with Edward, regardless of the transformation he underwent. Just as Arthur said, the Bellis 7 broke down. Whether it was the result of sabotage by the squad built to intercept Edward, or just the wear and tear of the journey it had undertaken the past few days wasn't clear. But what was clear was that Edward had to make the rest of the trek home on foot. Along the way, he passed a devastating sight: the wrecked remains of the Guardian. Just as Adam and the blacksmith had feared, the only hope of humanity had failed, and now all of mankind was at the mercy of the visitors and the reborn. Despite the hopelessness of it all, though, Edward continued on, walking countless miles, passing through several ruined towns, fighting through dozens of monsters, and passing by one of the capsules of the visitors. This last action proved to be the most dangerous, as without the radiation of the Bellis 7, nothing was protecting Edward from the gas expelled by the capsule, and he soon began to feel the effects of the visitor's medicine. Despite the pain racking his body, however, he continued on until eventually making it to Redmond. Much to his relief, he found that the city hadn't been destroyed by the visitors during the second visitation, and that people still lived in its homes and frolicked in the streets. But all of them had white eyes. They were all reborn. Passing through a building, Edward met a reborn Adam Thornton. Apparently, after the failure of the Guardian, he finally decided to stop resisting and go along with Arthur and Armand. In the next room, Armand, himself now reborn, preached to a crowd of his brethren, telling them the next steps in their plan now that the world was theirs. Whereas before it was a simple rural town, Redmond was now the home of the Reborn, where the new human society would start their work to achieve mankind's true potential. Edward felt like a stranger in his hometown, but stayed focused on his goal. He made it to his house and started the search for his daughter, but soon collapsed in his living room. His breath came to him in gasps as Arthur walked in from the other room. He loaded his rifle as black bile overwhelmed Edward's body, indicating he had no place in the new world. Before the end, Arthur gave Edward one last comfort. He promised the train driver that he would take care of his daughter, then took aim and fired, bringing an end to the story of the final station. It's a game that does a great job crafting a compelling mystery, and its ending leaves us with various questions about the change the characters in the world are forced to undergo. Is it morally okay to force people to suffer or just kill them off just to undergo a positive change for a minority of the population? Should morals even be considered in a situation like that? Could we still be considered human if we lose the part of ourselves that makes us empathetic to the suffering of our fellow man? All interesting things to mull around and consider. But due to the issues I mentioned in the intro, the game and its DLC fail to really make an impact with these themes without the player having to replay the game several times and undergo a ton of research to get all the events of the story straight in their heads. Now, before I finish up, there's something I want to mention with regards to the story. I actually haven't heard them say so themselves, but I've read that when writing the story, the developers of the game were heavily influenced by the science fiction novels of the Strugatsky brothers. The brothers are even mentioned in the game. They're the ones that made the knowledge base of visitor technology after the first visitation. And understanding that inspiration actually helps fill out some of the gaps in the story of the final station. In the Strugatsky novels, there are entities known as progressors and wanderers. Progressors are like secret agents that humanity sends to other planets in the universe to elevate the societies that live on those planets to the point that human society is currently at on Earth. For example, they would go to a planet that was only just beginning its industrial revolution and guide it through that era into the modern era. However, they could only do so from behind the scenes. They weren't allowed to take direct action on the planet. They could only guide the progress of the society. Wanderers are kind of like progressors, but for humanity. They're some sort of civilization in the universe that is more advanced than humanity currently is, that appears to want to help guide it to the next step in its evolution. With these in mind, when we reflect on the story of the final station, there are some obvious parallels between the progressors and the wanderers, and the reborn and the visitors. And I feel those parallels are integral to understanding the motivations of Arthur and understanding the overall direction of the story. So hopefully that helps clear some things up for you. Now, there are some things in the game I didn't mention, like the medieval battle Peter walks through when he's going through Arthur's teleporter, the X subplot and how he's called a missing link, and some of the strange experiments that are seen in the Reborn facility out west. But that's because they're not really explained too well, so I just kind of left them vague. And I'm sure there's some stuff in the video that could be wrong, but for the most part, this should cover most of the important aspects of the story of the final station. If there's anything that I missed that you'd like to point out, feel free to. I'd be happy to hear from you. Likewise, if you have any questions, which I'm sure you do because the story of the game is super weird, feel free to ask and I'll do my best to answer them. Before I go, I'd like to remind you that the audio of every episode is uploaded to Spotify as well as on YouTube, so feel free to listen over there if that's easier for you. Lastly, I'd like to give a shout out to my little boy Kieran. I love you, buddy, and I miss you lots every day. Alright, that's it for this one. Thank you for watching, and see you later. I love you, Kieran, you sweet little boy.